Welcome to the Extremely Boring Stories. Today we listening. The Frightful Life of Pirates. Imagine, if you will, the smell. Long before you see the wooden hull of a 17th-century man of war, the scent reaches you, a thick, gagging cloud of rotting tropical timber, stagnant bilge water, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of rising damp. We have been sold a lie by the silver screen. We see the billowing white sails and the adventurous grin of a rogue hero, but the reality of the golden age of piracy was not a quest for freedom. It was a desperate, often short-lived flight from a world that had no place for the poor, the broken, or the rebellious. To step onto a pirate deck was not to start a life of luxury, it was to sign your own death warrant and hand it to the ocean. The wooden world of a ship was a claustrophobic nightmare. Space was the most precious commodity on board, and as a common sailor, you had none of it. You slept in a hammock swung so close to your crewmates that you could feel the heat of their breath. Below decks, the air was heavy and recycled, thick with the fumes of the bilge, that disgusting mixture of seawater, animal waste, and spilled cargo that pooled at the bottom of the ship and sat there, festering for months. There were no showers, no changes of clothes, and no privacy. You lived, ate, and eventually bled in the same few square feet of salt-soaked oak. The tyranny of the rations. Food was not a comfort, it was a survival challenge. The primary staple was hardtack, a biscuit made of flour and water baked so many times it became as hard as a brick. To eat it, you had to bang it against the table to knock out the weevils, small black beetles that lived inside. If you were lucky, the weevils stayed in. If you weren't, you ate them for the protein. The meat was no better. Salted beef or pork was stored in barrels for years, becoming so tough and chemically preserved that sailors used to carve it into buttons or decorative boxes rather than eat it. Then came the scurvy. This wasn't just a minor sickness, it was a horrifying disintegration of the human body. Without vitamin C, the connective tissues in your body literally began to dissolve. Old wounds, healed decades ago, would miraculously reopen. Your gums would swell until they covered your teeth, which would then drop out one by one. Your skin would bruise at the slightest touch, and your mind would succumb to a profound, weeping depression before your heart eventually gave out. This was the silent killer of the Caribbean, claiming more lives than any naval broadside or pirate boarding party ever could. The social contract of the damned. Why did they do it? Why would a man choose this life? To understand the pirate, you must understand the merchant navy they fled. On a legal ship, the captain was a god. He could have a man whipped to death for a minor insult. He could withhold pay for years, leaving a sailor's family to starve while he grew rich. The pirate ship was a radical, albeit violent, reaction to this tyranny. On a pirate vessel, the captain was elected. He only held absolute power during a chase or a battle. At all other times, the quartermaster represented the interests of the crew. They lived by a code, a set of articles that every man had to sign. These articles were surprisingly progressive for the 1700s. They provided for a primitive form of disability insurance. If you lost a limb in service to the ship, you were paid a set amount from the common chest before any treasure was divided. It was a democracy of the desperate, a floating republic where every man had a vote, provided he was brave enough to hold a cutlass. The thunder of the broadside. When two ships met on the high seas, it wasn't the graceful dance you see in the movies. It was a chaotic, deafening, and suffocating experience. A pirate ship didn't want to sink its prize. After all, a sunken ship holds no gold, so the goal was to paralyze the enemy. This began with the long nines, the cannons at the bow, designed to tear through the rigging and sails of the fleeing vessel. Imagine the sound. A crack like 1,000 trees snapping at once as the heavy hemp ropes and canvas sails came crashing down onto the deck, trapping the sailors beneath a mountain of white fabric. As the ships drew closer, the real horror began. The air would grow thick with the black smoke of gunpowder, a sulphurous, choking fog that blinded everyone on deck. You didn't see your enemy, you felt them. You felt the vibration of the hull as a 24-pound iron ball slammed into the oak planks. These cannonballs didn't just pass through the ship, they created splinters. In the age of sail, a splinter wasn't a tiny piece of wood in your finger. It was a jagged, 2-foot-long spear of oak, blasted off the internal walls by the force of the impact, flying through the air at lethal speeds. Most men in naval battles weren't killed by the iron balls themselves, but by the ship they were standing on being turned into a cloud of wooden shrapnel. If you were wounded in the heat of the fray, your journey took you downward, into the cockpit, or the cable tier. This was located below the waterline, the only place relatively safe from incoming fire. But safety was a relative term. In the dim light of a few flickering tallow candles, the ship's surgeon, who was often just the carpenter if no medical man was available, would be waiting. There were no painkillers, no anesthesia, and certainly no understanding of germs. The surgeon's tools were terrifying in their simplicity: a curved knife, a heavy-toothed bone saw, and a bucket of sand to keep the floor from becoming too slippery with blood. If a limb was shattered by a splinter or a lead musket ball, there was only one solution: amputation. A skilled surgeon could remove an arm or a leg in under 2 minutes. The patient would be given a leather strap to bite on, or perhaps a meager swallow of watered-down rum, and then the screaming would begin. If you survived the shock of the surgery, you then had to face the infection. In the damp, filthy hold of a pirate ship, surgical fever, or gangrene was almost a guarantee. To be a pirate was to live in a state of constant, looming physical ruin. But why did they fight so hard? It wasn't just for the gold. It was for the articles. Every pirate ship operated under a written contract, and for many men, this was the first time in their lives they had ever possessed rights. On a merchant ship, a captain could withhold your food or beat you for no reason. On a pirate ship, the food was distributed equally. Even the captain didn't get a private cabin or a better meal unless the crew voted for it. This was the great irony of the pirate life. These men were outlaws, thieves, and often worse, yet they lived by a stricter and more democratic code than the civilized world they left behind. They had insurance. If you lost your right arm, you might be awarded 600 pieces of 8 from the common fund. If you lost an eye, you got 100. This wasn't charity, it was a business model built on the understanding that every man on that ship was a partner in a high-stakes, lethal gamble. They were brothers of the coast, bound together not by loyalty to a country, but by a shared hatred of the gallows and a shared love for the fleeting, violent freedom of the horizon. Perhaps the greatest enemy wasn't the Royal Navy, but the weather. We think of pirates always in motion, but the doldrums, the areas of the ocean where the wind simply stops, were a psychological death trap. A ship could sit for weeks on a mirror-still ocean under a blistering tropical sun. The water in the barrels would turn green with algae. The heat would become so intense that the pitch used to seal the deck planks would melt and bubble. The rotting foundation. The war against the ship. While we imagine pirates spending their days counting gold, the reality was a never-ending, back-breaking war against the ship itself. A wooden vessel in the 18th century was a living, breathing organism that was constantly trying to die. The Caribbean was not just a playground for outlaws, it was a graveyard for timber. The warm, tropical waters were home to the Torado navals, the shipworm. These weren't actually worms, but wood-boring clams that could tunnel through a thick oak hull until it was as fragile as a honeycomb. A ship that looked sturdy from the outside could literally disintegrate under the feet of its crew during a storm because the internal structure had been eaten away. To combat this, pirates had to perform the most dangerous and grueling task of their lives: careening. They would find a secluded beach, empty the ship of its heavy cannons and supplies, and then use a system of pulleys and ropes to heave the entire multi-ton vessel onto its side. This left them completely vulnerable. If a British frigate spotted a careening pirate ship, the pirates were trapped, their guns were on the sand, and their home was tipped over. Once the hull was exposed, the men would spend days in the blistering heat, scraping off layers of sharp barnacles, rotted seaweed, and shipworms, then breaming the wood by scorching it with torches and coating it in a foul-smelling mixture of tallow, sulfur, and tar. It was filthy, exhausting work that left the men covered in chemical burns and blackened soot. The illusion of Port Royal and Nassau. When the pirates finally did make it to land, it wasn't the tropical paradise of postcards. Places like Port Royal in Jamaica or the Republic of Pirates in Nassau were described as Sodoms of the New World, but for the average sailor, they were nothing more than a different kind of trap. These towns were built on swamps. They were thick with mosquitoes carrying yellow fever and malaria, diseases that killed far more pirates than any hangman's noose ever did. The wealth of a pirate was also a fleeting illusion. Because they were outlaws, they couldn't exactly walk into a legitimate bank. When a pirate came ashore with a pocket full of silver, the local merchants, the tavern keepers, the gambling dens, and the traders would jack up their prices by 500%. A pirate would spend in a single week what a merchant sailor earned in a year, not because he was generous, but because he knew he might be dead by the next moon. The economy of these pirate havens was predatory. The pirates were the prey, and the townspeople were the scavengers, picking them clean of their stolen loot until the sailors were forced back to sea simply because they couldn't afford a meal on land. The psychology of the "no quarter" flag. We must also speak of the flags. The Jolly Roger wasn't just a bit of theater, it was a sophisticated tool of psychological warfare. The goal of a pirate was to win without firing a single shot. If a pirate ship raised the black flag and the merchant ship surrendered immediately, the crew was usually treated with a terrifying kind of rough justice. They might be robbed, but they were often allowed to live. However, if the merchant ship resisted, the pirates would lower the black flag and raise the bloody red. This red flag, the Jolly Rouge, meant no quarter. It was a signal that the time for mercy had passed. It meant that once the pirates boarded, every soul on the opposing ship would be put to the sword. This was the dark heart of the pirates' reputation. They had to be seen as monsters, because if they weren't feared, merchant ships would fight back, and a pirate crew couldn't afford the casualties or the damage to their vessel. They cultivated an image of madness and cruelty as a business strategy, but the weight of that mask was heavy. To maintain that fear, they had to occasionally commit acts of such profound brutality that it stained their souls forever, creating a cycle of violence that they could never escape. The constant companion. The shadow of the gallows. Every pirate lived with a phantom standing behind them, the High Court of Admiralty. Unlike land-based thieves, pirates were hostis humani generis, the enemies of all mankind. This was a specific legal term that meant they had no country and no rights. Anyone, from any nation, was legally allowed to capture and kill them. The trial of a pirate was usually a formality. The evidence was the ship they were on and the weapons they carried. The sentence was almost always the same: to be taken to a low water mark, hanged by the neck until dead, and then left there until 3 tides had washed over them. In London, at the infamous execution dock, the bodies of famous pirates were often covered in tar and hung in iron cages called gibbets. They were left to swing in the wind for years, their bones rattling as a warning to every sailor entering the Thames. They died in the salt, and they rotted in the salt, a final, grim irony for men who had spent their lives trying to escape the constraints of the world only to be permanently shackled to its coastline in death. History often paints the pirate deck as a world exclusively of men, but the salt spray did not discriminate. Among the roughest crews were those who lived a double life, women who traded the suffocating constraints of 18th-century society for the freedom of the sea. The stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous, but they were likely not the only ones. To survive, these women had to be more than just capable. They had to be fiercer, louder, and more skilled than any man on board to keep their secrets. They wore the same grease-stained trousers, handled the same heavy rigging, and swung the same heavy cutlasses. When they were eventually captured, their defense was a legal loophole: pleading the belly. In the eyes of the law, a pregnant woman could not be executed until she had given birth. It was a desperate, final gamble for life. But the existence of these women proves a larger point about the horrible life. It was a life so preferable to the poverty and servitude of the land that even with the threat of the gallows looming over them, women were willing to cut their hair, change their names, and live in a world of constant violence just to have a say in their own destiny. By the late 1600s, the Caribbean was becoming crowded. The Royal Navy was increasing its presence, and the easy targets were disappearing. This gave birth to the pirate round, a massive, grueling trek that took ships from the Americas, around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa, and into the Indian Ocean. This was not a journey for the faint of heart. It meant months upon months at sea without seeing land, crossing the roaring forties, where the winds were so powerful they could strip the skin off a man's face. The goal was the Grand Mogul's fleet, ships carrying gold, silk, and spices from India to Arabia. One successful haul on the pirate round could make every man on the ship wealthy enough to retire for 10 lifetimes. But the cost was a descent into madness. Scurvy would decimate the crew. The heat of the Indian Ocean would rot the very clothes off their backs. By the time these ships reached their hunting grounds, the men were little more than ghosts, held together by the singular, burning hope of a grand prize. When they did find it, the violence was unspeakable. They weren't just fighting for money anymore, they were fighting to justify the months of starvation and misery they had endured to get there. For those who survived the journey, Madagascar became the new frontier. It was a lawless island, vast and untamed, where pirates built fortified settlements. There were rumors of Libertalia, a utopian pirate colony where all men were equal and slavery was abolished. While Libertalia was likely a myth, the reality of Madagascar was a strange melting pot. Pirates traded stolen silks for cattle and lived among the local Malagasy people. But even this was no paradise. It was a place of exile. Most pirates who reached Madagascar never saw their homes again. They were marooned by geography. They spent their days guarding their dwindling piles of gold, watching the horizon for a pardon that would never come or a naval fleet that would come to burn their settlements to the ground. The tropical diseases here were even more virulent than in the Caribbean. A man could be rich beyond his wildest dreams, sitting on a chest of diamonds, and die of a simple infected mosquito bite within 48 hours. The wealth was useless in a land where there was nothing to buy but more rum to numb the boredom and the fear. There is a horror we rarely talk about when we discuss pirates: the empty hold. When a ship was lost at sea, or the winds failed, or they simply found no prizes, the pirates faced the most primitive of fears. They would start by eating the rats. Once the rats were gone, they would move on to their own leather boots and belts, boiling them for hours to make them soft enough to chew. In the most extreme cases, the law of the sea took over. This was a grim, silent agreement that if the crew were to survive, one must be sacrificed for the many. They would draw lots. The shortest straw meant a death more certain than the gallows, and a fate that would haunt the survivors until their dying breath. This was the true face of piracy, not a golden age of adventure, but a desperate, starving struggle against a cold and indifferent ocean that cared nothing for their codes, their flags, or their stolen gold. To a pirate, the ocean was not just a body of water, it was a sentient, often vengeful entity. When you live on a wooden plank separated from a 3-mile drop by only a few inches of oak, the mind begins to play tricks. Superstition wasn't just a hobby, it was a survival mechanism. They believed that the sea demanded a balance, a life for a life. This is why many sailors refused to learn how to swim. They believed that if you fell overboard, the sea had claimed you, and to fight back by swimming was to insult the ocean, ensuring it would come back for the rest of the ship later. Every sound had a meaning. The whistling of the wind through the rigging was never just the wind, it was the whistlers, the spirits of drowned sailors calling for company. You never whistled on deck yourself, for fear of whistling up a storm. They looked for omens in everything. A shark following a ship for days was a certain sign that someone on board was about to die. The appearance of St. Elmo's fire, a ghostly, glowing blue light that would dance on the tips of the masts during a thunderstorm, was seen as a divine presence, either a warning of doom or a sign of protection from St. Erasmus. In the dark of the night, with the hull creaking like a dying man's ribs, these myths were more real than any law of physics. How did these outlaws find a tiny speck of coral in the middle of 1,000 miles of blue? They had no GPS, no reliable watches, and often, no accurate maps. Navigation was a mix of primitive geometry and gut instinct. They used a cross-staff, or a backstaff, to measure the angle of the sun or the North Star above the horizon. This gave them their latitude, their position north or south. But longitude, knowing how far east or west they were, was almost impossible to calculate accurately in the 1700s. To compensate, they used dead reckoning. This involved throwing a wooden board attached to a knotted rope over the side of the ship and timing how fast the rope pulled out. This is where the term knots for speed comes from. They would then guess their speed, factor in the push of the currents and the drift of the wind, and literally draw a line on a piece of paper. If their math was off by even a fraction, they wouldn't find the island they were looking for. They would sail straight past it into the empty Pacific, where they would starve to death in the blue desert. The fear of being lost at sea wasn't a metaphor, it was a mathematical probability they faced every single day. Because they were outcasts, pirates often had to turn to folk medicine. That was as horrifying as the diseases they tried to cure. For a headache or pressure in the brain, some pirate surgeons still practiced trepanning, drilling a hole directly into the skull to let the demons out. For yellow fever, they might use bloodletting, draining a pint of blood from an already weakened man in the belief that the sickness lived in the heat of the veins. One of the most common ailments was lead poisoning, not from bullets, but from the pewter plates and lead-lined water tanks they used. It would drive the crew slowly insane, causing tremors, irritability, and hallucinations. A ship full of lead-poisoned pirates was a powder keg of paranoia. They didn't know why they were losing their minds. They simply assumed the ship was cursed or that a crewmate was practicing obeah, or witchcraft. This physical and mental decay turned many pirate voyages into ghost ships, long before they actually sank. We often imagine pirates as loud, boisterous men singing shanties. But the reality of a long voyage was a heavy, oppressive silence. There is a specific kind of madness that comes from seeing nothing but the horizon for 3 months. It's called maritime fugue. The brain, starved of new visual stimuli, begins to hallucinate. Men would swear they saw green fields and forests in the waves and would sometimes simply step off the side of the ship to walk home. The captains had to keep the men busy with make work, scraping decks that were already clean, splicing ropes that didn't need it, just to keep their minds from snapping. When the silence was finally broken by the cry of "Sail ho!" from the crow's nest, the explosion of violence that followed was often a release of all that pent-up mental pressure. They didn't just fight for the cargo, they fought to prove they were still alive, to break the crushing boredom of the infinite blue. The iron fist of the quartermaster. While the pirate code offered rights, it was far from a peaceful life. On a ship where every man was an armed outlaw, the only thing preventing total anarchy was the threat of immediate, visceral punishment. This was the domain of the quartermaster. If the captain was the CEO of the pirate enterprise, the quartermaster was the judge, jury, and often the executioner. One of the most feared punishments wasn't death, but the sweatbox. In the blistering heat of the Caribbean, a man would be locked in a wooden crate barely large enough to stand in, positioned on the deck under the direct, unshielded sun. As the wood absorbed the heat, the temperature inside would climb to over 120 degrees. Dehydration and heatstroke would set in within hours. The victim would be left there for days, surrounded by the sounds of the crew working just inches away, a living ghost trapped in a vertical coffin. This was used for minor infractions like laziness or disrespect, but the mental scars lasted a lifetime. The cat and the salt. For more serious crimes, theft from a crewmate or desertion, the cat o' nine tails was brought out. This was a whip with 9 knotted lashes, designed to mimic the claws of a predator. Every strike didn't just bruise, it flayed. The cat would tear the skin from a man's back in long, bloody ribbons. But the cruelty didn't end with the whipping. To prevent the wounds from festering in the humid salt air, the surgeon would often rub raw salt or pickle brine directly into the open gashes. The agony was unspeakable, a white-hot fire that would cause men to swallow their own tongues in pain. They called it, giving the pirate a new shirt. It was a public ritual, designed to remind every man on board that while they were free from the king's law, they were never free from the ship's law. The marooning, a living death. Then, there was the ultimate punishment for the ultimate betrayal, marooning. This was the sentence for those who stole from the common chest or deserted their post in battle. A man wouldn't be killed outright. Instead, he would be taken to a quay, a tiny, uninhabited spit of sand that would be submerged at high tide. He was given a bottle of water, a small amount of gunpowder, and a single-shot pistol. The cruelty of the pistol was intentional. It wasn't for protection, there was nothing to hunt on a sandbar. It was an invitation. The pirates would sail away, leaving the man to watch the horizon until the sun began to blister his skin and the thirst drove him to drink seawater, which only accelerated the madness. Most men didn't wait for the tide or the hunger to take them. The single shot would ring out across the empty water just as the pirate ship disappeared over the curve of the earth. It was a clean way for the crew to kill a brother without technically shedding his blood themselves. The rise of the pirate hunters. By the 1720s, the Golden Age was beginning to rust. The world's empires decided that the cost of piracy was finally outweighing the benefits of ignoring it. This gave rise to a new breed of sailor, the pirate hunter. These weren't just naval officers, they were specialists, men like Woodes Rogers and Jonathan Barnett, who were given letters of marque to hunt pirates with their own tactics. The hunters used few ships, merchant vessels that looked like easy, defenseless targets. They would hide their cannons behind false wooden panels and keep their hundreds of soldiers hidden below decks. A pirate ship would approach, thinking they had found a ship full of sugar and silk, only for the merchant to suddenly drop its disguise, reveal a wall of heavy iron cannons, and unleash a devastating broadside at point-blank range. The hunters didn't want captures, they wanted carcasses. They began to tighten the noose around the Caribbean, turning the pirates' own hunting grounds into a massive trap. The age of the rogue was ending, replaced by the cold, calculated efficiency of the industrial naval machine. The myth of the buried treasure. We have been raised on stories of X marks the spot, and chests overflowing with Spanish doubloons buried beneath a palm tree. In reality, a pirate burying his treasure was an admission of failure. Pirates were the ultimate consumers, they didn't want to save for the future because they didn't believe they had one. Money was meant to be liquid, spent as quickly as possible on rum, gambling, and the temporary comforts of a port. Furthermore, the treasure they captured was rarely gold. Gold is heavy, rare, and difficult to move. Most of what pirates stole was surprisingly mundane, yet vital for survival. They stole bolts of cloth to replace their rotting clothes. They stole barrels of salt to preserve meat. They stole soap, candles, and, most importantly, medicine. To a pirate crew dying of scurvy or infection, a chest of surgeon's tools and a jar of Peruvian bark, used to treat malaria, was worth more than its weight in diamonds. They were scavengers, picking through the pockets of the Atlantic trade to find the basic necessities that the civilized world denied them. The logistics of the loot. When a ship was captured, the vendee began. This was an on-deck auction where the captured goods were sold to the crew at a discount, with the profits going into the common fund. If they captured a cargo of sugar or tobacco, they faced a massive problem. How do you sell it? You couldn't just sail into London or Havana and set up a market. This led to the rise of fences, corrupt governors and merchant middlemen in the American colonies who would buy stolen cargo for pennies on the dollar and then sell it back into the legitimate market. The pirates were essentially the exploited labor of a global black market. They took all the risks, faced the gallows, and endured the storms, while the wealthy merchants in New York and Rhode Island grew fat on the cheap goods the pirates provided. The horrible life was a cycle of theft where the pirate was often just a temporary holder of wealth that eventually flowed back into the pockets of the very society that hunted them. The courtroom, the theater of death. When the pirate hunters finally succeeded, the transition from the deck to the dock was swift and brutal. The Admiralty courts were designed not to find the truth, but to provide a spectacle. These trials were the true crime entertainment of the 18th century. The public would squeeze into the galleries to hear the scandalous details of life on the high seas, while the accused pirates were often denied a lawyer. The most famous piece of evidence in these trials was the Black Book, the ship's articles. If your name was on that paper, you were as good as dead. Some pirates tried to claim they were forced men, that they had been kidnapped and made to sign the articles at the point of a sword. To prove this, they had to show they hadn't partaken in the common dividend, or the jolly beverage, the ceremonial drink after a capture. Most failed. The judges wanted a clean ending to the Golden Age, and that required a high body count. The final speech, the gallows humor. There was a tradition at the gallows known as the last dying words. The condemned were expected to give a repentant speech, warning others to avoid the path of sin. But pirates, true to their nature, often used this moment for one last act of defiance. Some would dress in their finest stolen silks, appearing more like lords than criminals. Others would crack jokes at the executioner's expense. When the pirate captain, Easterling, was asked if he repented, he famously told the crowd that his only regret was not killing more of the men who captured him. This wasn't just bravado, it was a final rejection of a world that had offered them nothing but poverty before they took to the sea. As the short drop happened, a method of hanging that didn't snap the neck but instead caused a slow, agonizing strangulation, the crowd would watch for the hanging match, the desperate kicking of the legs. It was a cruel, public end to a cruel, public life. The pirate became a warning, a tarred corpse swinging in a cage at the harbor's edge, slowly being reclaimed by the salt air until only the bones remained. The Red Flag Fleet, the empire of Zheng Yi Sao. While the pirates of the Atlantic were often disorganized groups of a few dozen men, the South China Sea birthed a pirate machine so powerful it could, and did, defeat entire national navies. At the center of this was a woman named Zheng Yi Sao. She didn't just command a ship, she commanded a confederation of over 1,800 vessels and an estimated 80,000 outlaws. This was not a horrible life of scavenging, it was a military state on the water. Her code was even more terrifying than the Caribbean version. If a pirate disobeyed an order, he was beheaded on the spot. If a pirate was found to have mistreated a female captive, he was executed. If a man went AWOL, his ears were chopped off in front of the entire fleet. This absolute discipline allowed her to run a protection racket that covered the entire Chinese coast. She taxed every merchant, every fisherman, and every village. She became so powerful that the Qing dynasty, unable to defeat her in battle, eventually offered her a grand pardon. She retired not to a gallows, but to a life of luxury, running a gambling house with her spoils. Her story serves as the ultimate what if, showing what happens when the pirate life moves from desperate survival to organized conquest. The scavengers of the wreck, the salvage pirates. Back in the West, as the Golden Age faded, a new and perhaps more sinister form of piracy emerged, the wreckers. These weren't men who hunted on the open sea, but predators who waited for the sea to do the killing for them. Along the jagged coastlines of the Outer Banks or the reefs of the Florida Keys, these people would wait for storms. Legend says they would hang lanterns from the necks of horses and walk them along the beach. From a distance, a ship in a storm would see the bobbing light and mistake it for the stern light of a ship in safe water. They would steer toward the light, only to smash their hulls against the hidden rocks. The wreckers would then swarm the dying vessel, not to save the sailors, but to pick the cargo from their cold fingers. This was the darkest evolution of the outlaw life, a total abandonment of the mariner's code, of helping those in distress, replacing it with a cold, opportunistic hunger for the debris of disaster. The domestication of the ghost. As the final pirates were hunted out of the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, something strange happened in the collective human mind. The men who were once viewed as the enemies of all mankind, men who were smelled before they were seen, who died of rotting gums and lead poisoning, began to be transformed. The Victorian era took the jagged, blood-soaked reality of the pirate and sanded down the edges. Through novels like Treasure Island and later the stage plays of London, the pirate was reborn as a romantic figure. The Jolly Roger became a symbol of rebellious cool rather than a signal of no quarter. We stopped talking about the sweatbox and the Dorado worms and started talking about parrots and hidden gold. This was a necessary psychological trick. By turning the pirate into a fairy tale, society could finally stop fearing the very real conditions, the poverty, the naval tyranny, and the systemic cruelty that created them in the first place. The final horizon. The horrible life of a pirate was a brief, violent flicker in the history of the world. Most Golden Age pirates lasted less than 2 years before they were killed, captured, or died of disease. It was a life of extreme highs and devastating lows. One day, you were drinking captured punch out of a silver bowl. The next, you were boiling your own shoes to keep from starving, or watching a surgeon approach your leg with a rusty saw. They were men and women who reached for a life of freedom and found only a different kind of cage, a cage made of salt, wood, and the inevitable shadow of the noose. They left behind no monuments, only legends written by the people who hanged them. But as long as the wind whistles through the rigging and the tide pulls at the shore, the ghost of the pirate remains, a reminder of what happens when the world pushes people so far that they decide to declare war on the world itself. The anatomy of a storm, the ocean's fury. To understand the pirate life, you must understand the moment the horizon turns from blue to an bruised, oily black. In the Caribbean, a hurricane does not arrive with a bang, it arrives with a terrifying silence. The wind drops, the birds vanish, and the air becomes so heavy it feels like breathing through wet wool. This was the eye of the storm, approaching, and for a pirate ship, it was a race against gravity. The order would come to shorten sail. Men would scramble up the shrouds, the rope ladders, as the ship began to roll. Imagine being 60 feet in the air on a wooden spar, the wind howling at 70 miles per hour, trying to tie down a canvas sail that has the strength of a wild animal. If the sail caught the wind, it could snap a man's arm like a dry twig or fling him into the black void of the sea. There was no man overboard drill in a hurricane. If you fell, you were dead before you hit the water, swallowed by waves the size of 4-story buildings. The screaming wood. Below decks, the ship became a torture chamber of sound. A wooden ship is held together by thousands of wooden pins and iron bolts, and in a storm, every single one of them screams. The hull groans as it is twisted by the force of the water. The working of the ship, the way the planks rub against each other, creates a sound like a giant grinding his teeth. The bilge, water, which usually sat quietly at the bottom, would be thrown against the ceiling, drenching everyone in a foul-smelling slurry of rot and waste. The cannons, each weighing 2 tons, were the greatest internal threat. If a breeching rope snapped, the cannon would become a loose cannon, a 2-ton iron wrecking ball rolling back and forth with the motion of the ship, smashing through bulkheads and crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be in its path. Sailors would have to risk their lives to throw hammocks and spare coils of rope under the wheels to stop the momentum before the gun punched a hole right through the side of the ship. The moral weight of the deep. In these moments, the articles and the code meant nothing. The fierce, gold-hungry pirate was reduced to a terrified human being. It was said that there were no atheists in a Caribbean gale. Pirates who had spent their lives mocking the church would be found on their knees, clinging to the mast, praying to any god who would listen. The psychological toll of surviving such an event was profound. After the storm passed, the gray morning would reveal a ship that was barely a ship anymore. The masts might be snapped, the food stores ruined by salt water, and several crewmates simply gone, vanished into the night. This was the horrible life, at its most raw. The realization that for all your stolen gold and your reputation for cruelty, you were nothing more than a speck of dust on the coat of the Atlantic. The scavengers of the aftermath. Once the storm subsided, the work didn't stop. A dismasted ship was a sitting duck. The crew would have to jury-rig a new mast using spare spars and bits of rigging, a process that could take days of back-breaking labor under a sun that was now as merciless as the wind had been. This was often when the predatory nature of piracy turned inward. If the ship was too damaged to continue, the crew had to decide who stayed and who went in the small, jolly boat. These were the moments where the true character of a crew was revealed, not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, starving days of the aftermath, where the last of the fresh water was guarded with a loaded pistol and eyes that no longer recognized friends. The architects of cruelty. Edward Lowe and the Red Flag. If there is one name that should haunt the history of the sea more than any other, it is Edward Lowe. While some pirates were seen as social bandits, Lowe was a predator of the worst kind. He was born into the slums of London, a man who had been hardened by poverty until his heart was as cold as the deep Atlantic. He didn't just want your cargo, he wanted your fear. Lowe was famous for flying a blood-red version of the Jolly Roger, a signal that no mercy would be shown. His punishments were so inventive and so gruesome that even his own crew eventually grew to fear him. He was known to mutilate captives not for information, but for his own amusement. His life serves as a grim reminder that when society casts people out and leaves them to rot in the horrible life of the merchant navy, it sometimes creates monsters that can never be tamed. Lowe eventually vanished into the mists of history. Some say his crew finally grew tired of his madness and set him adrift, a fittingly lonely end for a man who turned the ocean into a slaughterhouse. The Butcher of the Caribbean, François L'Aulnay. Before the Golden Age even truly began, there was the era of the buccaneers, and at the head of that era stood François L'Aulnay. He was a man who hated the Spanish with a burning, obsessive passion, likely born from his years as an indentured servant. L'Aulnay was not a sailor of finesse, he was a conqueror of land. He led raids on entire cities, like Maracaibo, turning them into ash. His horrible life was defined by a total lack of empathy. History records that he once tore the heart out of a Spanish soldier and bit into it to show his men how little he feared his enemies. But the sea has a way of balancing the scales. L'Aulnay met his end not on a gallows, but on the shores of Darien, where he was captured by a local tribe that had suffered under his raids. He died in the very wilderness he had tried to conquer, his name becoming a campfire story used to frighten sailors for a century to come. The Pirate's Legacy, Mapping the Modern World. We look back at these 4 hours of misery, rot, and violence, and we ask, what was it all for? Beyond the stolen silk and the drowned men, the pirates actually changed the world. Because they were so effective at disrupting trade, they forced the great empires of Europe to professionalize their navies. The modern Royal Navy and the United States Navy find their distant roots in the desperate need to hunt down the men we have discussed today. Pirates also inadvertently mapped the world. Their secret hideouts in the Bahamas, Madagascar, and the Virgin Islands became the foundations for modern cities and trade routes. They were the unwitting pioneers of globalization. Even our concepts of democracy and workers' rights owe a strange, dark debt to the articles signed on pirate decks. They proved that men from different nations, religions, and races could work together for a common goal, even if that goal was theft. The final fade, the echo in the salt. As we reach the end of our script, the images of the Golden Age begin to dissolve. We must strip away the Hollywood makeup and the romantic music. The true pirate was a man with missing teeth, skin burned leather brown by a merciless sun, and a mind haunted by the things he had seen and done. He was a man who lived fast because he knew the short drop and a sudden stop was waiting for him. He was a product of a world that offered him a choice: die slowly in a factory or a field, or die quickly on the high seas with a vote in his hand and a cutlass at his side. The horrible life of pirates was not a tragedy of choice, but a tragedy of necessity. As the audio fades and the waves continue to crash against the shore, remember that the ocean does not remember their names. The gold is gone, the ships are rotted, and the bones are sand. All that remains is the wind in the rigging, a long, lonely whistle that sounds, if you listen closely, like a warning from the ghosts of the damned. The Architecture of the Abyss, a tour of a pirate sloop. To understand the soundscape of your audio, we must walk through the vessel itself. Most pirates didn't sail the massive galleons seen in cinema, they preferred the sloop. It was fast, agile, and had a shallow draft that allowed it to hide in sandbars where heavy Navy frigates would run aground. Imagine standing at the binnacle, the wooden stand housing the compass. The only light allowed at night was a single candle inside this box, shielded so it wouldn't ruin the helmsman's night vision or alert a nearby hunter. Moving forward, you hit the main hatch, the mouth of the ship. Below this lay the hold, a dark, airless cavern where the ballast, usually heavy stones or pigs of iron, kept the ship upright. In a storm, if the ballast shifted, the ship would capsize in seconds. The air down here was so foul it could extinguish a lantern. This was where the horrible life was truly felt, the damp, the dark, and the constant sound of water pressing against the other side of the oak planks, just inches from your head. The songs of the shanty, the rhythm of survival. We must speak of the sea shanty, but not as a campfire song. These were functional tools. On a ship with 80 men and miles of rope, coordination was a matter of life and death. The halyard shanty was used for heavy lifting. The rhythm told the men exactly when to pull in unison. Without the song, the weight of the sails would be impossible to manage. But there was a darker side to the music. In the long weeks of the doldrums, when the ship didn't move an inch, music was the only thing keeping the crew from mutiny. They played fiddles, concertinas, and even trumpets stolen from merchant prizes. The music wasn't joyful, it was a desperate attempt to drown out the sound of the ocean and the intrusive thoughts of a starving mind. A pirate ship was a loud, cacophonous place, the constant thrum of the wind, the creak of the wood, and the low, guttural chanting of men trying to stay alive through rhythm. The invisible fleet, the pirates of the Mediterranean. While the Caribbean dominated the Golden Age, we cannot ignore the Barbary corsairs of the Mediterranean. Their life was a different kind of horror. These were state-sponsored pirates who operated for centuries. Unlike the Atlantic pirates who sought gold, the corsairs sought white gold, human beings. They used galleys, ships powered not just by sails, but by hundreds of oars. The oar slaves lived in a state of unimaginable suffering, chained to their benches for months at a time, eating, sleeping, and dying in the same spot. The corsairs remind us that piracy wasn't always a choice for freedom. Often, it was a massive, industrial-scale system of human trafficking and forced labor that fueled the economies of entire empires. This adds a global weight to our story, showing that the horrible life was a shadow that stretched across every sea on Earth. The final silence. Why the age ended. The Golden Age didn't end because the pirates grew tired or the gold ran out. It ended because of the chronometer and the marine insurance. Once the world figured out how to measure longitude accurately, ships didn't have to follow the same predictable shipping lanes where pirates waited. They could take thousands of different routes across the ocean. Simultaneously, Lloyd's of London and other insurance giants made it more profitable for governments to protect trade than to ignore it. The pirate was an inefficiency in the machine of global capitalism. As the world became mapped, the dark corners where a pirate could hide simply vanished. The horrible life ended not with a final battle, but with the arrival of the modern world, a world of schedules, clocks, and law that had no room for the wild, unpredictable ghost of the sea. The language of the damned. Decoding the cant. To step onto a pirate deck was to enter a world with its own dictionary. If you didn't learn the language quickly, you were a liability. A pirate didn't just talk. They used a dialect born from the mixing of English, Dutch, French, and African tongues. They called it the cant. When a sailor spoke of swinging the lead, he wasn't being lazy, he was literally dropping a lead weight into the water to check the depth, a task that required total focus. If someone was at a loose end, it wasn't a metaphor for boredom. It meant a literal rope had come undone in the rigging, a mistake that could cause a sail to collapse and kill a man. The way they spoke of death was equally unique. To dance the hemp fandango was to be hanged. To go to Davy Jones' locker was to be buried at sea. Even the way they described the ship itself was anthropomorphic. The head of the ship was the toilet, located at the very front so the waves would wash it clean. The waist was the middle of the deck, often the deadliest place to be during a boarding action. By using these terms, pirates created an in-group identity, a way to separate the brethren from the landlubbers who lived safe, soft lives on shore. The physics of the broadside, the gunner's nightmare. We must pause to look at the great guns. A pirate's life often revolved around the maintenance of these iron monsters. A 6-pounder cannon didn't just sit on the deck, it lived on a carriage, a wooden frame with 4 small wheels. Managing these was a delicate, lethal dance. When a cannon was fired, the recoil was violent. The entire 2-ton mass of iron would leap backward toward the center of the deck. It was held in place by breeching ropes, heavy hemp lines that absorbed the shock. If those ropes were old or rotted, the cannon would tear through them and roll uncontrollably across the deck, crushing legs and smashing through the opposite side of the ship. The gunner had to be a master of chemistry, knowing exactly how much black powder to use. Too little, and the shot would fall harmlessly into the sea. Too much, and the cannon itself would burst, turning into a fragmentation grenade that killed everyone in the gun crew. The scourge of the sun, the psychological toll of heat. For 4 hours of audio, we must dwell on the environment. In the Caribbean, the sun was not a friend, it was a predator. Pirates spent their lives in a state of constant, low-level heat stroke. The deck planks would become so hot they could blister bare feet. To survive, they would slush the masts, coating the wood in animal fat to keep it from cracking in the heat. This fat would turn rancid in the sun, adding a sickening, sweet smell of rotting meat to the already foul air of the ship. The men would wear slops, loose, baggy trousers, and often nothing else, their skin turning to the color and texture of old leather. This constant physical discomfort stripped away their humanity. It's hard to maintain a sense of morality or mercy when you haven't had a full night's sleep or a cool drink of water in 6 months. The horrible life was a grind of sensory deprivation and physical agony that turned even the most civilized sailor into a desperate, reactive animal. The ghostly aftermath, the ocean's memory. As we finally close the logbook on the Golden Age, we look at what the ocean kept. The horrible life did not end on the gallows for everyone. For thousands, it ended at the bottom of the sea. Modern marine archaeology has found the wrecks of pirate ships like the Queen Anne's Revenge or the Whydah Galley. What they found wasn't just gold. They found small personal items, a lead tobacco box, a pair of pewter cufflinks, a bone whistle. These are the true ghosts of the Golden Age. They remind us that behind every terrifying legend of a pirate king were dozens of nameless, frightened men who just wanted to eat a meal that didn't have worms in it. They were the discarded waste of a global empire, men who chose a short, violent life of liberty over a long, slow life of slavery. In the end, the ocean is the only true witness to their struggle. It swallowed their crimes, their gold, and their screams, leaving us with nothing but the fading echoes of the salt spray. The unseen crew, the biological nightmare. While the pirates were the masters of the deck, they shared their wooden world with an army of unwanted passengers. To reach the depths of the horrible life, we must look at the ship as a floating incubator. The most pervasive of these were the rats. These weren't just nuisances, they were a catastrophe. A single pair of rats could produce hundreds of offspring in a year, eating through the already meager food supplies and gnawing on the leather rigging that held the ship together. In the dead of night, a sleeping pirate might wake to the sensation of a rat nibbling on the calloused skin of his feet. But smaller still were the lice and the itch. Personal hygiene was non-existent. Without fresh water to wash, the salt and sweat created a crust on the skin that became a breeding ground for parasites. This led to sea scabies, a condition where the skin became so inflamed that men would scratch themselves until they bled, leading to secondary infections that could turn a simple itch into a life-threatening case of septicemia. The horrible life was not just lived against the Spanish or the British. It was lived against 1,000 microscopic enemies that were slowly devouring the crew from the inside out. The folklore of the abyss, sea monsters and omens. When the sun went down and the ship was a lonely speck on a black ocean, the pirates' world became a place of myth. They believed in the Kraken, not as a legend, but as a biological reality. They spoke of giant squids that could pull a sloop beneath the waves, a fear fueled by the real sightings of massive, tentacled carcasses found floating in the Gulf Stream. To a pirate, every ripple in the water was a potential monster. They also lived in fear of the Flying Dutchman, the phantom ship cursed to sail forever without ever making port. Seeing a ghost ship on the horizon was considered a death sentence for the entire crew. It was said that the air would grow unnaturally cold, and the compass would spin wildly. These superstitions weren't just idle talk, they dictated how a ship was run. If the crew believed the ship was cursed, they might refuse to work, leading to a silent mutiny, where the men simply sat on the deck and waited for the end. This psychological fragility was the hidden weight of the pirate life, a mind constantly balanced on the edge of a superstitious breakdown. The trial of the tides, the executioner's science. For the final hour of our journey, we must examine the cold science of the law's end. When a pirate was sentenced to be hanged at the low water mark, it was a piece of judicial theater designed to show that the king's law extended even over the ocean. The gallows were built on the mudflats. The execution was timed so that as the pirate gasped his last breath, the tide would be coming in. The law required that the body remain on the gallows until 3 tides had passed over it. Imagine the sight. A man swinging in the wind, his feet dipping into the cold salt water as the tide rose, then being left to rot in the sun as it receded. This was the ultimate, horrible life, ending, a denial of a proper burial, a denial of being part of the earth. The pirate was forced to remain in the very element he had tried to master, even in death. This was the Admiralty's warning, a gruesome monument that lined the harbors of the world, from London to Port Royal to Rhode Island. The final echo, the silence of the horizon. As we draw our 4-hour narrative to a close, we return to the sound of the waves. The golden age of piracy lasted barely 30 years, yet it occupies a massive space in our imagination. We have explored the rot, the scurvy, the storms, and the gallows. We have stripped away the silk and the rum to find the shivering, desperate men beneath. The true legacy of the pirate is not a chest of gold, but a question. It asks us, what is the price of freedom? For these men, the price was everything. They gave up their homes, their health, their souls, and eventually their lives, all for a few years of living by their own rules on a vast, indifferent ocean. As the narrator's voice fades, imagine the last pirate ship sailing into a sunset that never ends, not as a hero, but as a ghost, a remnant of a time when the world was still big enough to get lost in, and the horizon was the only law that mattered. The forensic reality. The body as a map of misery. To truly grasp the 4-hour weight of this story, we must look at a pirate not as a character, but as a biological specimen. If you were to examine a pirate who had survived 5 years on the account, his body would be a map of trauma. Beyond the scars of the cutlass and the pockmarks of lead shrapnel, there was the sailor's eye. Constant exposure to the unrelenting glare of the sun reflecting off the salt water caused pterygium, a fleshy growth that would slowly crawl across the eye, clouding vision with a yellowish haze. Furthermore, the sea legs we joke about today were a physical deformity. Years spent balancing on a pitching deck in heavy weather caused a permanent thickening of the calf muscles and a structural bowing of the legs. When these men finally stepped onto dry land, they didn't just walk. They staggered, their inner ears so accustomed to the constant motion of the swell that the stillness of the earth felt like a dizzying, sickening vertigo. They were men who had become biologically synchronized with the ocean, making them permanent aliens to the land they once called home. The social taboo, the pirate's family. What of the lives left behind? A pirate's life was an act of total abandonment. In the eyes of the law, a man who went on the account was legally dead. This meant his wife back in London or Bristol was a sea widow. She could not claim his back wages from the merchant navy, she could not inherit his meager property, and she could not legally remarry for 7 years. Thousands of women and children were cast into the workhouses because a father or husband chose the freedom of the black flag. Some pirates tried to send money back through complex networks of fences and crooked merchants, but most of it was intercepted by the crown. The horrible life, was not just lived by the man on the deck, it was a shadow cast over entire families who lived in the shame and poverty left in the wake of a pirate's desertion. This was the hidden cost of the Golden Age, a generation of ghost families, waiting for men who would only ever return as names on a gallows list. The engineering of the chase, the nautical chess match, the horrible life, was also a life of extreme, focused boredom followed by hours of high-stakes engineering. When a pirate ship spotted a sail on the lee, a chase began that could last for 2 days. This wasn't a fast-paced pursuit, it was a slow, agonizing game of nautical chess. To squeeze every fraction of a knot out of the wind, the crew would perform wetting the sails. Men would climb the rigging with buckets of seawater and soak the canvas. Why? Because wet fabric is less porous than dry fabric, it catches the wind more efficiently. They would also shift the ballast, moving heavy barrels and cannons to the very back of the ship to lift the bow out of the water, reducing drag. If they were desperate, they would throw their own fresh water barrels and even their spare anchors overboard to lighten the load. It was a gamble. If they caught the prize, they would be rich. If they failed, they would be stuck in the middle of the ocean with no water and no way to anchor their ship. The final descent, the death of the Pirate Republic. As we approach the 4-hour mark, we must witness the final collapse of Nassau. The Republic of Pirates was never a city of gold, it was a city of shacks made from overturned boats and salvaged canvas. By 1718, the Republic was a den of disease and desperation. When Woodes Rogers arrived with the King's pardon in one hand and a fleet of warships in the other, the horrible life reached its crossroads. Most pirates took the pardon. They were tired. They were broken by the salt, the rot, and the constant fear. They traded their freedom for a chance to die in a bed. But for those like Charles Vane or Calico Jack, the pardon was a lie they couldn't swallow. They chose to sail into the narrowing gap of history. Their end wasn't a grand finale, it was a slow starvation, a frantic flight into smaller and smaller bays, until the great machine of the British Empire finally ground them into the dust of the shoreline. The Silent Passengers, a history of the slave deck. We cannot speak of the horrible life without addressing the darkest shadow on the water. Many pirate ships were originally Guinean vessels built for the horrific transport of enslaved people. When pirates captured these ships, they were moving through a space already saturated with human suffering. While some pirates offered a twisted form of freedom to those held in the holds, many others simply saw them as commodities to be sold for profit. The pirate deck was one of the few places in the 18th century where a black man could hold a weapon and a vote, but even this liberty was fragile, often balanced on the edge of betrayal. This adds a somber, heavy layer to the 4-hour narrative, reminding the listener that the freedom of the pirate was often built on the literal chains of others. It was a world of complex, often cruel contradictions that no romantic movie can truly capture. The archaeology of the unclaimed. What remains of the horrible life today? When archaeologists dive on sites like the Whydah off the coast of Cape Cod, they don't just find gold coins. They find the concretions, hardened lumps of sand and rust that, when X-rayed, reveal the ghost of the ship. They find silk stockings that have survived 300 years in the cold mud. They find pips, small clay tobacco pipes that were the pirates' only comfort. These artifacts tell a story of a disposable population. The pirates left no letters, no journals, and no estates. Their history is written in the debris they dropped overboard. Each pipe stem and lead musket ball is a fingerprint of a man who was erased from the official record of the world. By examining these remains, we see that the horrible life was a life of small things, a struggle to keep a pipe lit in a gale, a struggle to keep a pair of shoes from rotting off your feet. The gold was the myth, the lead and the clay were the reality. The domestication of the rogue, from horror to hero. As the 18th century turned into the 19th, the horrible pirate was moved from the gallows to the nursery. Authors like Robert Louis Stevenson and J.M. Barrie took the jagged, salt-stained reality and turned it into a story of adventure. They gave the pirates peg legs and parrots, symbols that were originally marks of horrific disability and desperate loneliness, and turned them into colorful character traits. This domestication was a victory for the state. By making the pirate a figure of fun and fantasy, the memory of their radical democracy and their violent rebellion was neutralized. We stopped fearing the enemy of all mankind, and started buying costumes of him. The final hour of our script reflects on this irony. The pirate only became immortal once he was no longer a threat. The true, horrible life was buried under layers of fiction, leaving us with a caricature that hides the starving, desperate, and revolutionary souls who actually sailed under the black flag. A parting word. We have spent 4 hours in the dark, damp world of the Golden Age. We have felt the sting of the lash, the heat of the sun, and the crushing weight of the deep. If you take one thing from this journey, let it be the understanding that these men and women were not monsters born of the sea, they were people broken by the land. The horrible life was a reaction to a horrible world. As the audio fades into the sound of the rising tide, think of the horizon. To a pirate, it was never a destination, it was a temporary escape. They lived in the between countries, between laws, and between life and death. The salt has reclaimed their bodies, and the wind has scattered their names, but the echo of their defiance remains in every wave that breaks against the shore. The chemical war, the brine and the bone. For a pirate, the ocean was not just water, it was a corrosive agent. To reach the deepest level of this narrative, we must look at the chemistry of the salt itself. Constant exposure to sea spray caused a condition known as brine burning. The salt would dry on the skin, forming sharp microcrystals that, when rubbed against by coarse canvas clothing, acted like sandpaper. Over a 4-hour journey, imagine the cumulative pain of a crew whose skin never truly healed, whose joints were constantly stiff from the humidity, and whose very bones felt the damp of the Atlantic. Even the metal on the ship was under attack. The iron bolts holding the hull together would undergo rustjacking, where the expanding rust would literally split the oak planks from the inside out. This created a constant, rhythmic weeping of the ship, small, unstoppable leaks that required the crew to man the pumps for hours every single day. This was the silent labor of the pirate life. It wasn't glorious, it was the back-breaking, repetitive task of pumping filthy water back into the ocean just to stay afloat for another hour. In your audio, the sound of the rhythmic, clanking pump should be a constant heartbeat in the background. The social hierarchy of the outcasts. While we have discussed the captain and the quartermaster, the horrible life was populated by specialists whose roles were vital yet miserable. We must speak of the powder monkeys, often the youngest boys on the ship, sometimes no older than 8 or 9. Their job during a battle was to run back and forth from the lightless, submerged powder magazine to the gun deck, carrying cartridges of highly explosive black powder. They ran barefoot across decks slick with blood and sand, knowing that a single spark from a cannon's backfire would turn them into ash. Then there was the cook, usually a man who had been so mangled in previous battles that he could no longer climb the rigging. He worked in the galley, the only place on the ship where a fire was allowed. This fire sat in a fire hearth, a brick-lined box that was a constant fire hazard in a wooden world. The cook's life was one of heat, smoke, and the impossible task of making rotted salt beef edible. These men were the ghosts within the ghost ship, the essential workers of the pirate age who lived in the shadows of the more famous kings of the coast. The psychology of the no-land horizon. There is a specific mental state that occurs when a human being does not see a fixed point on the horizon for months. Psychologists call it spatial disorientation, but pirates called it the blue madness. When you are surrounded by 360 degrees of identical horizon, The brain begins to lose its grip on time. Days blend into weeks. The only markers of passing time are the bells and the changing of the watches. This led to a culture of extreme storytelling. Pirates would spend hours spinning yarns, elaborate, often impossible stories about their past lives or mythological creatures. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a way to anchor their identities. Without a home, a family, or a future, their story was the only thing they truly owned. This is why pirate legends became so inflated. The pirates themselves were the primary authors of their own myths, exaggerating their cruelties and their riches to make their horrible lives feel significant in the face of a vast, indifferent ocean. The archaeology of the heart. As we draw this 4-hour script to its absolute conclusion, we must look at the last finds. In the wreckage of the Whydah galley, archaeologists found a small, silk ribbon tied into a lover's knot. It belonged to a man who would never return to the woman who gave it to him. This is the true ending of the horrible life. It is not a chest of gold or a pirate flag. It is a silk ribbon in the mud. It is a lead tobacco pipe. It is the realization that for every minute of freedom these men enjoyed, they paid with a lifetime of loneliness and a nameless grave. The pirate was a man who traded the world for the horizon, only to find that the horizon always stays exactly the same distance away. As the audio finally fades into the sound of the wind and the gulls, the story of the pirate becomes what it always was. A long, echoing cry for a life that was never quite within reach. The horrible life is over, and the sea is silent once again. The global map of lawlessness. To understand the scope of the pirates' world, we must look at the geography of the trade routes. The horrible life was dictated by the trade winds, the invisible atmospheric rivers that flowed from Europe to Africa, and then to the Americas. This created a great triangle of commerce, but for the pirate, it was a hunting ground with specific, lethal choke points. The Windward Passage, between Cuba and Hispaniola, was a narrow throat of the ocean where merchant ships were forced to congregate. Here, the heat was stagnant and the water was treacherous with hidden coral reefs. Pirates would wait in the dead zones, pockets of calm water behind islands where their smaller ships could be hidden by the jungle canopy. When a heavy, gold-laden galleon appeared, the pirates would use oars to pull their ships out into the path of the prey, a tactic that required the crew to row in the blistering sun for hours until their hands bled and their lungs burned. This was the strategic reality, hours of agonizing physical toil for a few minutes of violent opportunity. The anatomy of the pirate hideout. When we think of pirate islands, we think of treasure caves. The reality was far more mundane and miserable. A pirate base, like the early days of Tortuga or New Providence, was a collection of hovels. These were temporary shelters built from the ribs of wrecked ships and thatched with palm fronds. There was no sanitation, no clean water, and no law. The horrible life on shore was defined by the camp fever, typhus, and dysentery. Because the pirates didn't understand the link between waste and disease, their camps were often death traps. A man who survived a broadside at sea might return to land only to die of a fever in a canvas tent a week later. These settlements were not cities of gold. They were desperate, temporary refuges for men who knew the Navy was always just one fair wind away from burning their world to the ground. The forensic silence. The wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge. As our 4-hour journey reaches its final minutes, we look at the most famous ghost of the Golden Age, the flagship of Blackbeard. When archaeologists found the Queen Anne's Revenge in the shifting sands off North Carolina, they didn't find a chest of gold. They found urology syringes and mortar and pestles. These items tell the true story of Blackbeard's final days. He wasn't just a warlord, he was a man desperate for medicine. The ship was a floating hospital, filled with men suffering from the horrific effects of long-term maritime life. The treasure he was looking for in his final months wasn't silver, but a chest of mercury and bandages. This is the ultimate, horrible life revelation. The most feared pirate in history ended his life not as a conqueror, but as a desperate patient, hunted by a world that had moved past the age of the rogue. The final fade, the salt's inheritance. The golden age of piracy was a brief, violent scream in the middle of a silent ocean. It was a time when the enemy of all mankind proved that the world's empires were vulnerable, and that the ocean could never truly be owned. But the ocean always has the last word. The salt has claimed the oak. The sand has buried the iron. And the tide has washed away the blood. All that remains for us, 4 hours later, is the echo of the wind and the memory of a life that was lived on the very edge of the world. The pirate was a man who chose a short, horrible life of freedom over a long, miserable life of servitude. And as the sun sets on the final horizon of our story, we are left with the same question that haunted every pirate who ever sailed. Was it worth it? The ocean remains silent, offering no answer but the rhythmic, eternal breaking of the waves. The economy of the scrap, the scavenger's prize. While we have spent hours discussing the grand prizes of gold and silver, the reality of a pirate's income was often far more pathetic. To reach the 4-hour mark, we must look at the small prizes. Most captures yielded nothing more than a cargo of timber, cattle hides, or barrels of tar. The horrible life was a life of constant disappointment. A pirate crew might chase a ship for 3 days, risking their lives in a boarding action, only to find the hold filled with low-grade tobacco or salted fish. This led to a desperate kind of repurposing. Pirates became masters of recycling. They would take the sails from a prize to patch their own rotting canvas. They would strip the copper sheathing from a captured hull to repair their own leaks. They weren't just outlaws, they were the ocean's scavengers, living off the scraps of a global trade network that they could never truly enter. The clothing of the condemned, a sensory detail. We must dwell on the tactile reality of the pirate. Because they had no access to tailor shops, their clothing was a patchwork of theft. A pirate might wear a fine silk waistcoat stolen from a French merchant over a pair of filthy, tar-stained canvas breeches. This mismatch was a badge of their life, a mixture of extreme luxury and extreme squalor. The salt air would eventually stiffen these silks until they cracked. The metal buttons would green with verdigris, staining the fabric. The smell was a constant companion, a mixture of unwashed wool, rancid grease, and the sharp tang of gunpowder. In your audio narration, emphasize the crackle of the stiff fabric and the clink of the greened buttons. This was the uniform of a man who was already a ghost, wearing the clothes of a life he could never lead on land. The final silence of the sea chest. In the final minutes of our journey, we look at the pirate's only personal possession, the sea chest. This was a man's entire world. Inside, he kept his share of the loot, but also his remembrances. Archaeologists have found small, carved whalebone charms, locks of hair wrapped in scrap paper, and even small books of poetry. These items reveal the horrible life as a life of profound loneliness. These men were separated from everything they loved, often for years at a time. The sea chest was not just a storage box, it was a sanctuary. When a pirate died, his chest was auctioned off to the crew, his personal memories sold for a few pieces of eight to men who would soon meet the same fate. This was the ultimate erasure. Your very identity was liquidated to pay for the rum of your brothers. The conclusion, the horizon's end. We have traveled through the storms, the battles, the surgeries, and the gallows. We have seen the pirate as he truly was, a desperate, salt-burned man caught in the gears of history. The horrible life was a tragedy of the human spirit, a quest for freedom that ended in a cage, a quest for wealth that ended in a wreck. As the final bells of the watch sound in your ears, remember that the ocean does not care for our stories. The ships have long since vanished into the silt of the Caribbean. The gold has been melted down or lost to the tides. All that remains is the sound of the water against the shore, a rhythmic, eternal reminder of the thousands who lived, suffered, and died under the black flag. The forensic ghost. The life of a sunken hull. When a pirate ship finally met its end, whether by a lucky naval broadside, a hidden reef, or the simple, slow surrender to rot, it began a new life as an artificial reef. To understand the horrible life, we must understand the horrible death of the vessel itself. As the ship settled into the silt, the wood was immediately attacked by deep-sea organisms. In the dark, high-pressure environment of the seafloor, the ship became a time capsule of misery. Archaeologists looking at these wrecks today find concretion colonies, lumps of sand and iron that have grown around the pirates' tools. Within these lumps, the oxygen-free environment preserves things the land would have destroyed: leather shoes, scraps of silk, and even the remnants of the last meal eaten on board. These wrecks are silent witnesses to the daily struggle of the brethren of the coast. They reveal a life that was lived in a state of constant repair, where every bucket, every nail, and every rope was precious. The horrible life was a life of extreme scarcity, a fact that is written in the very debris of their sunken homes. The psychology of the death head, the symbol of the skull and crossbones, the Jolly Roger, is now a childhood toy, but to the pirate, it was a memento mori. They lived in a culture that was obsessed with death because death was their most frequent visitor. This led to a strange, dark humor on board. Pirates would often hold mock trials for each other, pretending to be judges and executioners, practicing the very sentences they knew they would eventually face. This was a psychological defense mechanism. By mocking the gallows, they tried to strip the short drop of its power. They lived by the motto, a merry life and a short one, but the merry part was often a thin veneer over a profound, weeping despair. The horrible life was a life of performance, a constant act of bravado meant to hide the fact that they were terrified of the dark, the deep, and the judgment that awaited them on the other side of the horizon. The final watch. The evolution of the horizon. As we reach the final minutes of this 4-hour journey, we look at the ocean one last time. The golden age of piracy didn't just end, it was paved over. The arrival of the steam engine and the telegraph in the 19th century meant that the empty spaces on the map, the places where a pirate could exist, simply vanished. The ocean was transformed from a wild frontier into a highway. The horrible life was a product of a specific moment in time when the world was expanding faster than the law could follow. Once the law caught up, the pirate became an impossibility. But the idea of the pirate, the man who says no to the machine of empire, remains. We have spent 4 hours exploring the rot, the blood, and the hunger, but we are left with the image of a lone ship, sails tattered, hull weeping, disappearing into a sunset. It is a haunting image because it represents a part of the human spirit that refuses to be tamed, even when the cost is a short, horrible life and a nameless grave in the salt. The cultural ghost. Why we can't let go. As we reach the final stretch of this 4-hour journey, we must ask why the horrible life has been transformed into a romantic legend. The answer lies in our own desire for escape. In a modern world of schedules, fences, and digital footprints, the pirate represents the ultimate, untraceable, human being. They lived in the great in-between, a space where a person could reinvent themselves, shed their name, and exist outside the gears of the state. But this freedom was bought with the currency of suffering. We look at the Jolly Roger and see rebellion. The pirate looked at it and saw a deadline. We look at the ocean and see beauty. The pirate looked at it and saw a graveyard. By documenting the filth, the disease, and the crushing loneliness of their lives, we don't diminish their story, we make it human. We see them not as cardboard villains or swashbuckling heroes, but as desperate men and women who were willing to endure a living hell just for the right to say they belonged to no one but themselves. The last ledger. The economics of erasure. As we look back over the 4 hours of blood, salt, and starvation, we must address the final horror, the erasure of the individual. In the 18th century, if you died as a merchant sailor, your name was recorded in a company ledger. If you died as a Royal Navy seaman, you were listed in the Admiralty's records. But if you died as a pirate, you simply ceased to exist. The horrible life was a life of total anonymity. Pirates often took nom de guerres, war names, to protect their families from the shame of their crimes. When a pirate ship went down, it wasn't just men who were lost. It was their true identities, their histories, and their lineages. For 4 centuries, these men have been ghosts of the census, people who chose a life so far outside the system that the system responded by wiping their names from the earth. This is the ultimate, short drop, not just of the neck, but of the memory. The geography of the ghost, the map's end. Where did the horrible life go? It didn't disappear, it just retreated. As the Caribbean became too civilized, the remnants of the Golden Age fled to the Galapagos, to the Cocos Islands, and into the jagged fjords of Patagonia. These were the final refuges, places so cold, so remote, or so desolate that even the British Navy didn't find it profitable to hunt there. In these places, the pirate life didn't end with a battle, it ended with a whimper. Crews simply dissolved. Men married into local populations, became turtle hunters, or lived out their days as hermits on islands that smelled of sulfur and bird droppings. The kings of the coast became the beggars of the beach, a final, pathetic chapter for a generation that had once held the world's commerce in a stranglehold. The final atmosphere, a sensory closing. Imagine the final scene of your documentary. The camera isn't on a person, but on a piece of Torado-eaten oak washing up on a beach in North Carolina. The horrible life was a sensory assault. It was the smell of hot tar and rotting citrus. It was the sound of a hull groaning under the pressure of 1,000 tons of water. It was the taste of salt that never left your tongue, even in sleep. It was the feeling of being perpetually damp, perpetually tired, and perpetually hunted. When you strip away the Hollywood music and the plastic swords, you are left with a group of people who were so desperate to escape a world that didn't want them that they fled into the arms of an ocean that wanted to kill them. They were the original outcasts, the first true rebels of the modern age. The bells have ceased. The watches are over. The ocean, which served as both their kingdom and their coffin, has reclaimed every debt. We look out at the horizon today and see a blue void, a place of vacation and commerce. But beneath that surface, in the silt and the dark, the Golden Age remains. It is a history written in iron and bone, a story of men who dared to be free and paid the ultimate price for the privilege. As the sun sets on this 4-hour journey, remember the cost of the salt. Remember the weight of the chain. And remember that the horizon, beautiful, distant, and cold, is the only thing that never truly changes. The surgeon's tools, a forensic inquiry. When archaeologists excavated the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, they found something more chilling than gold, a set of specialized medical instruments. To understand the horrible life, one must understand the horrible cure. The ship's surgeon, often a pressed man forced to serve under the black flag, carried a kit that resembled a torture chamber. There were cauterizing irons, meant to be heated red-hot to sear shut a stump after an amputation. There were trepanning saws, used to cut circles into the skull to relieve pressure from a head wound sustained in battle. But perhaps most telling was the urethral syringe. These were used to inject mercury into the bodies of men suffering from syphilis, a common plague among crews who spent their prize money in the brothels of Port Royal. The mercury didn't cure the disease, it slowly poisoned the patient, causing their teeth to fall out and their minds to fracture. This was the pirate's medical reality. The treatment was often as lethal as the injury. The psychology of the merry life. A merry life and a short one. This was the famous toast of the pirate Bartholomew Roberts. But as we reach the end of our 4-hour investigation, we see the merriness for what it was, a frantic, desperate hedonism. Pirates didn't drink because they were celebrating, they drank to forget the horrible life. They drank to numb the pain of rotted gums and salt-burned skin. This led to a culture of recklessness. Pirates would engage in trials of endurance, seeing who could sit in a smoke-filled hold the longest or who could drink the most bumbo, a lethal mix of rum, water, sugar, and nutmeg. They lived in a state of permanent presentism. Because they did not believe they would survive to see 30, they had no reason to build, to save, or to plan. They were a society of the now, a group of people who had collectively decided that a year of total freedom was worth an eternity of oblivion. The final warning, the gibbet. As the final pirates were hunted down in the late 1720s, the British Navy began to use a new, more terrifying deterrent, the gibbet. This was a human-shaped iron cage. After a pirate was hanged, his body wouldn't be buried, it would be encased in this cage and hung from a tall pole at the entrance to a harbor. The body was left there to rot in the sun, picked apart by gulls, for years. It was a living statue of death. As sailors entered the harbor, the first thing they would see, and smell, was the decaying remains of those who had defied the king. The wind would whistle through the iron bars and the bleached ribs of the pirate, creating a sound that sailors called the pirate's flute. It was the ultimate erasure of the horrible life. You didn't just die, you became a permanent landmark of failure, a warning that the ocean belonged to the state, and the state never forgets. The end of the watch. The 4 hours are spent. The sand has run through the glass, and the tide has reclaimed the shore. We have stripped the gold from the legend and found the lead beneath. We have looked into the eyes of the enemy of all mankind, and found only a man who was tired, hungry, and afraid of the dark. The horrible life of pirates was a brief explosion of human defiance against a system that treated men like machines. They were the grit in the gears of the world's first global economy. And as the audio fades into the sound of the deep, blue silence, let us remember them not as the heroes of a fairy tale, but as the casualties of a world that was too small for their ambition and too cold for their hearts. The horizon is empty. The watch is over.